In 2011, the Occupy Wall Street movement brought tens of thousands of people to the heart of New York's financial district to protest against austerity, corporate greed, and the depredations of capitalism, while also exploring what could replace it. Inspired by movements in Egypt, Spain, and elsewhere, the 60-day occupation of Zuccotti Park in turn inspired hundreds of further occupations across the world. New York-based activist, organiser, filmmaker and writer Marisa Holmes was an occupier from day one and has since been active in its many offshoots such as Strike Debt, Occupy Sandy, anti-racist solidarity work in Black Lives Matter and anti-fascism. Her film All Day, All Week draws on extensive footage to tell the story of Occupy Wall Street, and a recent book studies the movement's processes and structures based on assemblies, collective statements and live tweets. In July 2024, a series of events were held in Australia to discuss Marisa's experience of the Occupy Wall Street moment in terms of what worked and what didn't, as well as lessons to be drawn for the future. The following is a recording of one of these events, in which Commons Library team member Iain McIntyre interviewed Marisa before she took questions from the audience. Thanks to the Black Spark Cultural Centre for hosting the event, to Anitra Nelson for organising it, and Annie McLoughlin for recording it.
So let's start with, how did you become involved with Occupy Wall Street, and what was it about the idea of occupation and occupying that kind of drew you in?
I was already an organizer. I was a student, and I was unfortunately the class of 2008, so I was very unlucky, and there weren't very many jobs. So I had a personal interest in doing that work, but also there was this, larger wave of the Arab Spring that was very inspiring. It was a real social revolution that was taking off in Tunisia and Egypt and elsewhere, and I got in touch with some of the organizers in the Revolutionary Youth Movement in Egypt, and that's kind of a whole story unto itself. But I really thought that it was just the right moment for large-scale mobilization that would, be horizontal and democratic and respond to multiple crises that we were facing. And that's why I got involved, I guess. And I happened to be living in New York at the time, and so I knew some of the people who had been doing stuff around austerity organizing in New York, and we were able to put together this assembly, the General Assembly, and I guess I was recruited also. David Graeber kind of recruited me to facilitate, because I had this background in facilitation from previous movements, and they really needed someone who could facilitate these assemblies. And so it's actually a bit to do with David Graeber, how I ended up there and playing such a central role.
Yeah, so as was sort of mentioned and as you outline in the book, there'd been action in New York around austerity and the economic crisis, but it was sort of the intervention of adbusters in calling for action in the financial district on the 17th of September and kind of framing it as Occupy Wall Street that was kind of, seems like that was very decisive. However, they weren't based in the area, so it was people in New York who kind of took that forward. And then, later on, occasionally, adbusters would sort of intervene. So, I guess just thinking about that kind of role of adbusters, and what does it tell us about, I guess, sort of the usefulness and perhaps challenges of people instigating and intervening and kind of trying to kick off things perhaps a bit from the outside?
Yeah, we had a bit of a complex relationship with adbusters. We were in touch early on, and they actually shared some of their media accounts with us, and even contacts in the sort of mainstream press. So there was this collaborative approach, but they definitely had their own agenda. They wanted specific demands. They wanted to call on President Obama to do X, Y, and Z. And that's just not what we were doing in terms of the political vision of the occupation. So, we came to blows a bit over that, over the direction of the movement and, what to focus on. But they never showed up at the park. Very quickly it became evident that the people who were on the ground would set the tone for what happened.
Of course, a big part, as you mentioned earlier, and that there was these global movements happening, and that kind of inspired people. So sort of in the early stages when the General Assembly was first meeting and so forth, what sort of role did the ideas of internationalism and solidarity and this kind of inspiration from what was happening play?
Yeah, so there were direct connections. So I mentioned that I was connected with some organizers in Egypt, and went ahead of time in the spring to learn from some of the tactics on the ground and how they were holding the space in Tahrir Square. Other friends of mine in New York who were doing sort of media activism ended up going to Spain and collaborating with people in 15M and starting the media working group there, a commission there. So a lot of what we ended up doing with the live stream and sort of tactical approach to Twitter, that all came from these experiences in Egypt and Spain and trying to integrate lessons in real time. So yeah, we had direct collaborations, like both in person and online, across movements, and tried to amplify each other's struggles. And it was definitely internationalist, but an internationalism based on horizontality, on direct democracy, on a different way of operating, which was unique.
Yeah, so that sort of leads me to, a key theme that you explore in the book and that you identify as being sort of shared by the movements of 2011 was that, they typically involved a rejection of, limited representative democracy, but also authoritarianism in terms of sort of decision-making around, economics and so forth. And there were these calls for direct democracy. So while Occupy Wall Street was very much a sort of rejection of neoliberal capitalism and a protest, it was also sort of an experiment and an expression of what could replace it. And a key, certainly developed from the 50s, but kind of crystallised in the 70s, there's been this particular form of participatory democracy based around consensus, and consensus and direct action have come to be very much kind of paired in many movements. And, often there's these allied sort of structures of affinity groups and spokes councils. And so the classic sort of often criticism, of Occupy Wall Street and movements before, since, after, who've used these kind of forms is that, they're unwieldy and chaotic and slow, and particularly on a large scale. But many activists prefer them because they're prefigurative, they're democratic, they're inclusive, so people own, whatever decisions are made and so forth. Big question, but I guess if you could outline the sort of form that these decision-making processes took place at Occupy, and then how they kind of evolved over time, and in what ways do you think the decision-making forms kind of served the movement well, and in what ways could they have been improved on, or have you sort of seen them improved on?
There was a bit of a decisive moment early on in August 2011. A coalition that had organized Bloombergville, this occupation in front of City Hall, which was mainly focused on austerity measures and budget cuts. They had a lot of more authoritarian currents, like the Workers' World Party and, more hierarchical, traditional left organizations. And they initially tried to hold some kind of assembly, but it became very evident that they had no idea how to run an assembly because an assembly is democratic and they don't operate in a democratic way. So people showed up expecting an assembly, and then were just talked at for forever. they lost control of the crowd, basically, and we formed this other assembly space that was horizontal and democratic, and that became the basis for the New York City General Assembly. So people who were interested in that, opted in. Yeah, it was very important, I think, that we had this participatory ethos, because people did have, a say in the decisions that affected them, and they had a stake in the outcome of the actions. And so they kept coming back, and we decided early on to use consensus, but it was a modified version of consensus. So actually in the planning process, it was like consensus, but then we would drop to, 2/3 majority if there was a decision that was very contentious. So it was a modified form for sure. And then during the occupation, it went to like 9/10 because people felt that 2/3 was too close to a regular majority vote. We had all these conversations openly about how to change and shift the process. Yeah, and we had a facilitation working group, which I was part of, that did trainings every day. Most people, unless they're part of the radical left already, have no idea what consensus is or how to operate. So it was important that we do this kind of primer and have clear roles for people to step into. So before the assembly, we would do the training, and then we had a sort of roster of people who had been trained as facilitators who could step in or be a stack taker or whatever. Yeah, that continued throughout the course of the occupation. And initially we had 40 or so people in the planning stages, and then a few hundred people sleeping out, and then we had thousands of people. And of course, this brings up the question of scale. How do you do consensus or any kind of directly democratic process at scale? And so we decided to basically confederate and build from the working groups that had developed. So there's this kind of emergent nature of the working groups coming out of the assembly. By mid-October, we had over 100 working groups and over 4,000 people actively involved in organizing, not just like showing up to a rally or an event, but part of the organization, which, was a big shift in a month's time. So we formed a spokes council of the working groups in order to coordinate the functions of the park and ultimately beyond the park a bit better. Both the assembly and the spokes council were heavily attacked by what we know now as state actors and various right-wing elements, and so we had to be very kind of on guard about disruption and devise all kinds of schemes for sort of quieting people or taking them to the side or ousting them if need be. And there are a lot of different strategies, but we basically ended up democratically deciding sometimes that people had to go, but they were given a transformative justice, like road back, if they wanted to. Most people did not take that option, and then they just disappeared. So that's kind of how we dealt with it. There was a lot of sort of cultural impact, though, of disruption that was difficult to heal from. So we intentionally did a lot of healing circles and care days and things like this, and tried to rebuild. And that happened, after the occupation, around May Day 2012, and even into the 1-year anniversary. But yeah, it was quite a process. But I do think that the principle of consent, regardless of the specific formalities, which might change depending on the context, is important to operate by, because it values everyone's input, and it's respectful, and especially if you're engaged in high risk actions where you're under threat from police constantly, you need to have a high level of buy-in, for lack of a better, people need to really agree to it if they're standing off together. So yeah, there are a lot of reasons to do it, but I actually do think that it was effective and that we were able to build at scale, even though we dealt with a lot of challenges along the way.
Yeah, so I guess on that sort of fallback position, I mean, how often did you have to resort to voting, or was most of the time you were able to reach consensus without that?
I think the only times we had to actually vote had to deal with like large amounts of money or disruption. But for most of the day-to-day like coordination of stuff in the park, and that was very easy to come to consensus on. And even like the statements, we had like larger political statements and whatnot, and those we consented to fully, I think, all of them. Money and disruption, those are the things that were most difficult.
Okay, so just one more sort of question around the consensus decision making, because I think many people here, would have been involved with consensus decision making, and so keen to hear how others have navigated it and the bonuses of it and so forth. So I guess another issue that you kind of look at in the book is that organised factions or informal cliques can kind of come to dominate and kind of manipulate decision making in a way that kind of, I guess, stifles genuine consensus. Any kind of form of decision making can be manipulated and is subject to kind of cliques and factions. But what's your thoughts on how the spirit of participatory democracy can be kind of maintained in the face of those kind of manoeuvres?
Yeah, we had some informal elites, but the informal elites or cliques, they were people who were sort of professional political actors, some of them associated with the Democratic Party, some of them part of NGOs or labor organizers. So they were actively trying to shape things. They didn't believe in consensus or democracy or, from the beginning. They wanted Occupy to be something completely different. They imagined it as a kind of left version of the Tea Party and were quite upset when it didn't transform into that. But yeah, I think we just could have been like those of us who are anarchists or autonomists, who are anti-authoritarian, socialists, one form or another, who were involved. We just should have been like more tightly organized ourselves to combat some of these encroachments. But I don't know. But it's also tricky because it was a movement space where people were coming in and being radicalized in real time. And so if we had been like too strict about things, it also wouldn't have worked. So to some degree, the openness of it is what made it possible, but it also is what made us vulnerable in the end. I don't know, but I, in some cases, yes, really, people should have just been called out and should have been clear that they were not, part of the movement. But they weren't. I should clarify the informal elites. They would just go around the assembly and the council. They didn't even really participate in them. So it's not like they would come in and have like a faction that would dictate a certain party line or something like that. They just ignored us and did other things, and tried to get funding for their projects and set up an office and things like that. Yeah, so it's a bit different than like staffing a meeting or that kind of thing.
Direct action was a key theme of Occupy Wall Street, but there's a lot of different views on what direct action means. So I guess could you talk a bit about what the concept and practice sort of meant for you and how it sort of played out at Occupy, and I guess how were frictions between people with different ideas of direct action sort of managed, and how did they play out?
Technically, we had a diversity of tactics type framework. So honoring, nonviolent, violent, disruptive, whatever, this range of different tactics, right? And that comes out of really the global justice movement and convergence, decision making. So we brought that into Occupy, into the direct action working group. But the majority of the people involved were interested in, nonviolent strategy, and the trainers that we had were nonviolent direct action trainers, and so that definitely kind of set the tone for what we did, holding the space, and even actions beyond the space itself, such as the Brooklyn Bridge or other occupations, or rank and file labor stuff. So there's definitely this kind of approach. It was useful in terms of movement building. People, like, we had widespread support. We had like 70% approval rating at a time when Obama had like a 9% approval rating. Maybe if we had gone a little more hardline, or not gone a nonviolent route, I'm not sure what kind of support we would have had. So I don't know. It's always like you can go back and say what if we chose this or that. But I do think that we had a lot of support, and we used this nonviolent approach. And there are these continuities between movements, which, like Lisa Fithian, for instance, who was part of the global justice movement and other things, she was one of the trainers who came and passed down all this knowledge about holding space and defending it, and so.
Occupy Wall Street popularised the slogan and concept, "We are the 99%," and in return, the slogan and the idea, I think, was pivotal to your success. Like, I think it really seemed to, as you talk about in the book, chimed with people. In the book, you also talk about the need during and after Occupy Wall Street to kind of confront specific and intersecting inequalities within the multitudes. So could you comment on the sort of ideas of unity and difference within Occupy Wall Street, and the role of caucuses in kind of addressing different issues?
So first, on the 99%, we talked about it in the early assemblies and the planning process in the summer of 2011. Joseph Stiglitz, the economist, had written an article that spring. It was widely circulated, talking about the 1%, and then David Graeber is thinking about debt and how this related to the 1% and the 99%. And then there was an outreach group that was full of people from 15M, Kinseme, who were really concerned about the collective. In America, everyone's very individually focused. And they're like, well, where is the we? Where is the collective? So they came up with the we, the 99%. And then another member in the group who was running the food committee, which became the People's Kitchen, also was really into media stuff, and just decided for fun to make a Tumblr. And that was the we, the 99% Tumblr page. And at first, no one really posted anything. But once we were actually occupying, doing the action, there was just this flood of thousands of people, sharing their stories, and some of them were quite dark. People talking about foreclosures or healthcare issues, or all mental health issues, all kinds of things, and all kinds of different people. Like in terms of races, ethnicities, genders, ages. It was a wide spectrum of people who identified with the 99%. And we did kind of think about it as this identity that could hold many other identities, as a pluralistic approach, rather than just like the workers, Yeah, and yet there was this question of, is it too broad? Does that actually, limit the diversity? Does that have a homogenizing effect? There were within the park, within the assembly, there were different experiences that people had. And of course, just because you say, we're creating this prefigurative environment that is totally different than the world that we live in, we are part of that world, and we carry all of the baggage from that world. So it requires a lot of conscious effort to undo, race, gender, class, ableism, like all of these things. And so there were caucuses that formed in Occupy. There was the People of Color Caucus, the Women's Caucus, Queering, Occupy Wall Street, OWS Disability Caucus, and really, the Safer Spaces Committee did a lot of work. They technically didn't consider themselves a caucus. They were more of a working group, which is interesting. But they did a lot of the work that you would imagine a women's caucus to do. Yeah, but they weren't organized around sort of identity lines, more around the work that they were doing. And what they did was, develop agreements and establish a community watch every night to deal with, issues of abuse and assault and things like that. So yeah, there was a lot of work to do, even like within the prefigurative, space, to make the new world a reality.
Yeah, and you mentioned the Safer Spaces Committee, and you discuss in the book that you feel in retrospect Occupy Wall Street maybe could have, and again, it's all in retrospect, but it's also looking forward to what we can do better in the future, that it could have set a community agreement on behaviour kind of during the setup phase of the protest. So have you seen this done more successfully in actions and kind of protests since?
Honestly, I usually get a message like 2 days before someone's going to occupy something. And they're like, hey, can you help us? We've never done this before. And it's all a little bit haphazard. So I haven't actually seen a lot of good examples of this. But in organizations or like long-term spaces, where there are relationships that are, that are just more developed, agreements, having the Safer Spaces agreement is pretty common. I mean, I always try to encourage people to do it, whether or not they do it. Currently now, I'm part of a group that has a community accountability team that rotates.
Do you want to tell us a bit more about that?
Okay, I guess I'll say first that the Safer Spaces Committee, it was really inspired by Insight. Insight is was most active like 20 years ago. But they wrote a lot of really interesting work about violence against women and accountability in activist communities. And so it's a women of color collective. And they had a very holistic understanding of domination and how this worked out and personal relationships. The people in the Safer Spaces Committee have been reading a lot of that. And they've already been part of Support New York, which was doing this kind of work in the community. And so they just translated that over into the park. Some of those people continued after Occupy to do that kind of thing and to train other people. So I benefited from that. A lot of people benefited from that. And we also have the New York Peace Institute, which has mediation and usually for free, which is very helpful. And then in MAC, which I'm currently involved in, we decided to have our own internal accountability process, which is actually not just about abuse or harm done, but also just conflict in general, because we're human beings and we always have conflict, and especially on the left, there tends to be a lot of conflict. So just making a space for people, so it's not like an exceptional thing. It doesn't just because often what I've seen happen is that communities are just kind of hit with this, instance of assault or something, and it totally blindsides them. And then it's like, oh my gosh, how could this possibly happen, on the left? And just getting over that and understanding that, of course it's going to happen, So let's just try to develop these processes and think about it holistically and transformatively. And so I think we're actually in a much better place now than when Occupy happened. There's much more of a conversation around this kind of stuff and practice around this kind of stuff, at least in New York.
Might pick up on, you were talking about training before, and I guess again, since the 50s onwards, sort of nonviolent direct action training sort of been often proposed as a way to kind of prepare people for protests and pass on lessons, anticipate sort of likely issues. And there's sort of been shifts over time between that being quite popular in terms of sort of workshops and role players and stuff, and then at other times people kind of moving very much kind of away from it. And then within the training itself, I guess at times some trainings are very focused on, I suppose, the dynamics of non-violence or the theoretical side, I guess, and other times it's been very just more about, right, these are your legal rights, how we anticipate, the police will respond or whatever. So in the book, you do talk about, that trainings at times became useful, but also like a lot of things, in the push and pull of the protest and of having to deal with sudden crises or the cops coming in, or that training tended to get pushed aside a bit in terms of the sort of hurly-burly. So, yeah, could you tell us a little bit about what the nature of the training was? And I guess, was it mainly pitched at newer people, or was it something that more experienced people took a part in?
Yeah, we did trainings every day. We did facilitation trainings that consisted of a kind of primer of the history and, why consensus, why prefigurative politics, and then just like practical sort of breakdowns of the roles, facilitator, stat taker, note taker, etc., vibes, watcher, and some of the hand signals. And actually the hand signals, they were kind of developed by someone who was an actor who wanted to dramatize a bit, what we were doing. And so that's why you have all these videos of the consensus fingers, which was fun, actually. I think people enjoyed it. And yeah, so we did that, and then the direct action trainings would be kind of a standard MBDA type framework. We would have lines, like hassle lines, often is what they're called in the U.S. I don't know what they're called here, but like a line with the cops on one side and the protesters on the other, and then you try to get through the line of the police, and how do you do that, and affinity group trainings, we would sort of mock, role play, like getting into small groups and thinking about how to move and strategy and different roles that people might have in the streets. Maybe someone's a medic, someone's doing legal, someone's, in a tactical decision-making role. So, yeah, we did that. And, there were also medic trainings. There are legal trainings, jail support trainings. There are educational things happening all the time. There's the think tank, and then the Free University that developed out of that. So it was really, you could spend the whole day just learning things and not actually organizing at all. If you wanted to just, hang out and learn, you could do that.
One of the things in your book and that I picked up, and which I think we saw here in Melbourne was, and I don't think it was necessarily, it wasn't really like necessarily a thought out thing, but the experience of having these different working groups to do things like legal monitoring and first aid and stuff actually sort of built capacity. And so the people who were involved with those things then went on to be part of sort of protests that followed and stuff. So, yeah, what was your experience of, I guess, that kind of capacity building, and people carrying on those roles later on?
Yeah, well, on the media trainings, so I was also part of the media working group. We had a kind of tactical media approach where some of us have been in indie media, if anyone knows the Independent Media Center, indie media movement, or have been sort of trained by people who were from that. There's this lineage. But with social media, it was a little bit of a different approach because obviously, these are corporate platforms. So how do we? So we did both at the same time, which I think is important to emphasize. Now people just throw things up on Instagram or TikTok or whatever. But what we did actually was build this like back end on the IRC servers in case all of our stuff was taken down. So we had both the alternative infrastructure and the, engagement with a more popular audience on social media. And we used live stream to generate clicks basically, and to get people there in person. It wasn't just an end in and of itself. It was also like, to organize them to come to the park, come to the space. So we trained a lot of people on how to do this kind of media work. And some of those people ended up forming Cop Watch chapters in New York, who were very instrumental in Black Lives Matter in 2014, 15, 16. Some of the people went on to form Unicorn Riot, which stayed out at Standing Rock and broke the stories at Standing Rock, among other, they've done a lot of anti-fascist reporting, a lot of different, reporting over the years. But yeah, that's just one example of, sort of how the training then built capacity for for other groups and other movements, going forward.
Awesome. So, yeah, I've been focusing a lot on the preparation and organisational side, but of course, those things are all about creating an occupation that could succeed in sort of shaking up powerful interests and generate lots of action and excitement. So could you tell us about some of the specific kind of events during the protest which you found particularly exciting and where you really felt like, wow, all the hard work's kind of come together?
Well, I mean, for me, the occupation itself was the event. The marches and various other actions that occurred were more like outreach to bring people to the liberated zone that we were building. So I was most interested in the building aspect of it, and to me it's fascinating. I mean, I really like being in meetings. Actually, I think it's fascinating what people are thinking and how they communicate, and just to be in this kind of social space, and even just to share things, sharing food or playing music or doing all these other kind of cultural activities in the space. I just liked being in that space. To me that was the most transformative. And it really did feel like a portal to another world. It's totally different rhythm and way of operating.
So, of course, this space was under a lot of pressure externally, and you had a range of kind of repressive tactics thrown at you. I suppose, for people who are preparing and anticipating for future actions, what do you think were some of the most effective counter tactics that were kind of used against you, and how did you counter them in return?
Well, the disruption was we had the more overt brutality of people getting beaten up and put in jail and whatever, all of that happens. But the most effective is really the emotional and psychological disruption, and that's COINTELPRO era stuff where people go into communities and infiltrate them and try to turn people against each other and use misinformation. And I would say a kind of counter move to that was really effective was something that a friend of mine, Kitty, did. So we had this assembly and I was facilitating, and some guy came up who was trying to instigate stuff, and he had a broken bottle and he was waving the bottle, trying to attack me while I was on stage. Kitty came up with this cardboard monster costume, a puppet kind of thing with long fang teeth, and just went "War!" Lunged at this guy, and it was totally disarming, and the guy didn't know what to do, and it brought everyone down. It created a different kind of space, and the threat was kind of neutralized. So sometimes doing kind of ridiculous and funny things, just changing the mood of the space, can be really helpful to undermine,
So in terms of the kind of more overt pressure from the police and so forth, I mean, you talk in the book about there were some strategic blunders on their side, and you talk about the way that people were able to turn around the Brooklyn Bridge kettling, so that kind of backfired. As part of the media working group, if you could give us some insights into how you kind of tried to shape and did shape the narrative in your favour.
We basically just tried to get ahead of the news cycle and set the tone for whatever was going to be covered by showing what was happening on the front lines. So we would be in the front lines filming, and then try to get everything out as soon as possible, edit short pieces that could go viral, and that was pretty effective, especially with the Brooklyn Bridge, because the NYPD, they led us onto the bridge and then they did this mass arrest, but they were really brutal about it, and it was a moment when public opinion shifted in our favor. And even with the unions, there was this kind of break. So there were some relationships with the unions that were, sometimes they were helpful, sometimes they were not helpful and actually undermined what we were doing. But in that moment, the connections were helpful because the MTA workers refused to load us onto the buses, and that actually prevented a lot of people from going to jail. And it illustrated this break that was happening, within the kind of political scene in the city, that the unions were no longer, collaborating with the police against us. They're firmly, like, on our side. So, yeah, the Brooklyn Bridge was a big turning point.
Were there any particular things once the occupation was happening and then these other occupations were happening, were there particular exchanges that you felt, really kind of shaped what was happening in New York?
Yeah, I mean, it was a constant kind of stream of, people hearing each other, learning from each other. There was this feedback loop. After the occupation, there was this call from Occupy LA to do a general strike, and we took up that call, and that kind of determined the strategy for the next 5 months. So that was an important kind of moment of solidarity. And
okay, well, one more question before throw it open to questions from the audience. So, in the book, again, talking about this kind of exchange and dialogue, you talk about, there was an intergenerational dialogue through kind of forms of action and just people being, different ages and different experiences, and also, these kind of information exchanges with other occupiers around the world. And you talk in the book about you feel there's very much a need for people to undertake more political action to help set firm intentions, principles and boundaries. And you've contributed to this through your film and through the book and, through being here today, kind of sharing lessons and thoughts and experiences. So what sort of guides you in this kind of process of work, and can you talk a bit about why it's important to document our movements?
It's important to document because, all of our movements are already documented by our enemies, by the state, by corporations, by those who seek to undermine us, and they write the histories of what happens, and they end up in textbooks, and future generations look at that, and they have a very distorted idea of what occurred. And so if we don't document, we don't have the sources to refer to build our own history. And, we really, in Occupy, we spoke for ourselves. We were against representation. So, it made sense to continue on, with this work. Yeah, I hope that everyone who's in a group or a movement does similar kinds of projects, and then we can learn from each other.
Shall we throw open some questions?
Thanks a lot for coming and running this. So first of all, a really good, a positive thing, like the effect on some of the younger people I now know who live in the country town that I live in, was that they were politicised by Occupy Melbourne, and they're now in our very small local anarchist group. So that was transformative for them, and I think we can never underestimate the transformative effect of taking direct action and taking that kind of collective stand, really. But two things I wanted to ask. One is, the depressing thing is throughout 70s, 80s, 90s, and what the period you're talking about is the response of the state, which is the incredibly punitive and painful and imprisoning people and so on. And, that is something that we can talk amongst ourselves about a way to respond. And I've got one other question after that. Will I whack that in? I'll whack that one in too. So I've just started reading If We Burn by Vincent Bevins, and I just wanted to hear your comments on his book.
So, how to deal with increasing repression. We do a lot of jail support trainings, legal defense. A friend of mine who was an anti-fascist political prisoner was in prison at Rikers Island in New York during the pandemic, and it was really awful. But we did work to get his story out, and the stories of other prisoners, and even in really kind of dire situations, the organizing continues. And obviously people deal with this every day. If you're Black and brown or in America, it's very likely that you'll end up dealing with the carceral system. So, if we can really work on supporting each other, dealing with the system, and doing more trainings and stuff, I think that's one way. And on the Bevins thing, I haven't read the book. A lot of people have referenced this book but really has nothing to do with like our experience of organizing it. And I mean, he was a journalist who floated around and did his own work, but like I never met him, I never talked to him, I have no idea. It feels very removed from anything that I'm involved in, but somehow it keeps coming up. So maybe I should read it just to critique it, but.
Yeah, we just did Bevan's in the Extinction Rebellion book club, and he does actually blame horizontalism for what he says is the failure of 7 out of 10 of those movements, not including Occupy.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I'm very interested because I think you can be against representation, but you probably still have leadership. So I was very curious about what the role of those 40 people who sort of planned it at the start. I'm guessing from what you say that they somehow kept it on track on the way through. Like things like deciding to have non-violent training rather than violent tactics training, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, Occupy would not have happened if it wasn't horizontal, because the whole moment, the zeitgeist was like to build like the horizontal networked forms of organization. And, I give this example of, DC, there were 2 different encampments. One was hierarchically run by established activists for many decades. No one went to that one. They all went to the horizontal one because they had a say in the decisions that affected them. And that grew and grew. And so, yeah, I just think it's a ridiculous argument, honestly. And then on leadership, I mean, of course, there are many, many leaders. Everyone who participated in cooking at the People's Kitchen, or, took up a camera in the media working group, or planned, an action, or carried a banner, or whatever, all of these people were leaders. And yeah, I mean, it was definitely not the case that there was some kind of secret like cadre of people, orchestrating the entire thing. Even those of us who were involved at the beginning, we saw ourselves as being in service to the larger movement. The Zapatistas would say like lead by obeying, right? So you're walking with other people, you're listening to them, you're trying to build the collective capacity, you're not dictating the terms of what happens. I mean, nothing happened in Occupy that like people didn't want to happen. It was definitely a democratic space, and I think that was what was transformative about it.
Thanks. So from the student movement perspective with what's going on, the Gaza genocide right now at University of Melbourne, I think we're really curious if you have any insights about what's going on in the States and what you're seeing, what you're learning, and maybe actually how it's a bit different, this movement, and what's going on than, what you were fighting for with Occupy.
Yeah, I mean, it's an absolute horror what's going on in Gaza. Makes sense that people would be angry and move to action around it, and that there would be this new wave of people involved in Palestinian liberation. This is just the sort of latest, chapter in a much longer struggle for liberation, against settler colonialism. Yeah, I spent some time at the different camps in New York, doing trainings, doing teach-ins, even just basic things, like how to do jail support, because, I mean, there are a lot of young people, very, 18-year-old college students who have never done anything before like this in their lives. And they're just, motivated by the sense of moral outrage and, having to do something. And so they just like did actions, but, without a lot of the infrastructure already in place. And so a lot of us were, just trying to support them. And, in the camps themselves, there was a fair amount of self-organization because people were living together, even for a short amount of time. And that required having like, a kitchen and a Nedic station and all these things, just to sustain life in the camp. I mean, there are similarities, certainly, young people taking actions, international solidarity, like with the Middle East, and, all these, you can draw all these parallels with Occupy. But it is a little bit different because this moment is very kind of singularly focused on Palestine. And it, it kind of needs to be because of the intensity of the brutality that's taking place and the genocide that's taking place. What we were doing was, like, we saw ourselves as in solidarity with this global movement, but we weren't just doing things to support, the Egyptian revolution. We were also talking about our own situation and our own struggles, and trying to really foment a social revolution in the United States. So it was a little bit different. The way that people were thinking about internationalism and thinking about their positionality. Yeah, I see some parallels in the encampments, but I actually think it's much closer to the anti-apartheid movement in the 80s in terms of the structure and just how people are thinking about the solidarity work.
My question is kind of vague, trying to format. The piece that Judith Butler wrote entitled "So What Are the Demands?" piece. I don't know if you know it. It had a big impact on me at the time, and kind of gets at this argument about you don't want to validate the state by making demands. You validate the state as saying they can satisfy them. But the thing I'm thinking about now is just there's something that I always think about just mess and proposal-based decision making, where you allow yourselves a level of creativity and ideation that the piece that I think gets discussed less with the nonprofit industrial complex is just this urge to box everything into typical strategic frameworks right away. And you think about, aside from everything else with horizontality, just the value of mess and sitting in discomfort and conflict and things like that. I wonder if you have any reflections on how that felt in the moment and how to cultivate that in movement spaces, or whether it's worth cultivating at all.
Yes, the value of mess. Yeah, I will say first, I definitely sat through, probably a number of you here have sat through NGO strategic planning sessions, and sometimes they're very corporate feeling, with the charts and the PowerPoint and even the way that people talk about it, and it can be quite boring and just demoralizing. At least I don't know. That's how I feel about it. But being in this kind of beautiful mess of an assembly where people are throwing out ideas and building on each other's contributions. At least you feel alive. At least you feel like there's something, worth contributing to. And it may be difficult, and maybe you hate whatever the person said, but then you work it out, you have that debate. And I think actually you end up with better ideas and better actions in the long run because you have that space. I'm all for the mess.
I don't know whether this is part of Occupy generally or just in Melbourne. But one of the things that everyone was talking about was the idea that money is loaned into existence, and this idea of runaway inflation, or just, that the money supply and everything has to keep growing, which is obviously related to ecological collapse as well, and related to the idea that we've got to somehow do degrowth, but we've got a monetary system that has to grow, and you can't actually stop growing without collapsing. I don't know, you didn't mention, I don't know whether it was just a Melbourne thing or whether that was a more general thing about that money's loaned into existence and that's the fundamental problem.
Yeah, we were definitely, learning about debt, and one of the main sort of offshoots of Occupy Wall Street was Strike Debt, which had a holistic analysis of the debt system, linking student debt, credit debt, housing debt, medical debt, and calling for people to not pay, right? Basically have strike, a different kind of strike. Some of that was influenced by David Graeber's work, obviously, but there are other people too who have written about it. Certainly there are a lot of parallels with degrowth work. But yeah, we can't, you can't have, degrowth or have an ecological approach, that's transformative without doing away with capitalism. A lot of people have tried to do that and greenwash, but it's just not possible. Yeah, and we saw all of that as very interlinked in Occupy.
You spoke a little bit about explicit repression in space with sort of people attending assemblies and stuff, but I was wondering if you sort of have any thoughts on internalized repression and sort of how people sort of
I mean, I guess my question goes to like security culture and how sort of watching sort of these processes, which is sort of proposed to be open and stuff like that, people getting kind of like, I don't know, maybe sort of losing trust in the process and sort of, but still sort of not having the tools to sort of like, I guess maybe the question is like, we have these tools now from like watching the Arab Spring and sort of seeing like how that played out in different contexts, but seeing sort of in a context like Australia, where there's like comparatively few like sort of trained full-time organisers, I guess, these sort of like similar tactics being used, but sort of like, I guess the repression that people have faced up until this point has sort of like led them to sort of, I don't know, this is just my experience seeing like quite consistently like these processes start and then sort of stop down into sort of like more closed sort of, I don't know, maybe the question is sort of like, where do you see like security, like the need for security sort of like overtaking, have you seen that sort of happen in your experience or?
Like the rising like threat of fascism and the degree to which people are doxxed and targeted has made people on the radical left much more guarded and concerned about security, whether digital security or security within organizations. And maybe that's necessary, but it also makes it harder for people to come in and to have this transformative process. And I don't know, I actually don't know if it's like that strategic, because it means we're less visible, and we need to be visible. We need to be open and out in the streets and saying like we are not okay with fascism, and like most people aren't. I had this interesting experience in a public park. We were having a picnic actually, and there happened to be a lot of activists at this picnic. And on the other side of the park, there was this like, fringe fash group that was also having a picnic, but just hanging out, having a picnic, but they had a flag that, if you had done any research on neo-fascism, you would know what it meant. But no one else in the park knew what it meant, And so we went around, I started talking to people, hey, like that's that group. And they're like, oh, really? Well, we should go. Like, let's shout at them, tell them to leave. But I think sometimes there's this inhibition to do that because, people don't want to be outed. They don't want and take the risk. But actually, sometimes if you take the risk, a lot of people will be on board. I don't know. I'm not actually a big fan of like security culture. I'll say that. Also, I'm doing this talk, and I wrote a book. I'm pretty public. So I don't know, and I do get doxxed and death threats, and it happens. But so far so good. Yeah.
You've talked a bit about the disruptors, and you said that after the event you realised a lot of these people were state actors or from the right. How did you find out about that? And so are you saying that these people came into meetings and pretended to be just ordinary members of the activist community and kind of manipulated things? Is that what happened, and how did you find out about it?
Yeah, so, there was later a FOIA request and a lot of uncovering of like DHS and FBI documents, and that showed that there was infiltration from the state that was coordinated from the very beginning. We learned after the fact that that was the case from the state, although you can assume that that's always going to happen. And then as far as like specific actors related to the right, Breitbart was very early on in its development at that point. They were lambasting us all the time, writing terrible reports. And there was one person who was a key disruptor who was involved in, in the assemblies, and we can never really, get a handle on like who is this person? Like what is motivating her, And eventually some people just decided to follow her to see where she went, like physically. And, they did that over the course of like a week or so, and they figured out, oh, she keeps going back to this office at like 120 Wall Street. And what's in 120 Wall Street? Breitbart. So, there was this connection, and she was also like writing it, like she was often quoted in pieces in Breitbart as like a go-to source. There were photos found of her posing with Andrew Breitbart before he died, and also other photos online of her under like different names, different disguises. So yeah, people did a little bit of digging, like even just old school sleuthing, following people around, and made these connections. I mean, I can't say 100% that like she was on their payroll. I don't have that, but I can, deduce from that like they were working together in some capacity.
Thanks for your reflections. History should have something to say about the future. What do you see in your crystal ball for the remainder of this century and for activism's role and what you think is likely to happen?
Well, the future is what we make of it, right? So nothing is totally determined. But yeah, I mean, there are multiple crises, ecological crises, economic. So there definitely will be more uprisings, more revolutionary moments in the future as people deal with those challenges and the effects of those challenges. And and then we also have the fascist threat taking advantage of the crisis. So it will be a very contentious and violent struggle for the next couple of decades, I think. But I believe that people are capable of transforming themselves and the world around them, and that most people are really well-meaning people who want to contribute and help each other, and if given the opportunity, will do so. And I mean, I've seen that happen, certainly in Occupy. Like the vast majority of people who came to Occupy really gave their whole hearts and spirits to the thing. I mean, there were a few bad actors, but thousands of people did really amazing work. And so I think that it's possible to make a new world a reality, to make a world that's ecologically based, it's feminist, that is non-capitalist, it's horizontal. All this is possible to achieve. And I mean, there are real life examples now, with the Zapatistas or Rojava, or even smaller projects that are not in fully liberated zones, and they can kind of point the way to how to build that new world. But yeah, I mean, I think it's possible, but it'll be difficult, obviously.
All right, I think that's a great point to end on. So thank you, Marisa, for coming, and thanks for this fantastic book and the documentary, and sharing these lessons and experiences.
You've been listening to a recording of the Lessons from Occupy Wall Street event, which featured author and filmmaker Marisa Holmes. This podcast was produced by the Commons Social Change Library, a website containing over 1,000 resources for campaigners.